Hey everybody, and welcome to Bacon Bits, where I show you small little tips and tricks to help you get by in the FPV hobby. There's a ton of things to learn, and in these videos, we're going to quickly run down a lot of cool technical stuff that you may or may not know, and maybe you'll pick up some pointers along the way. But today, I have something that we all wind up doing with an FPV quad eventually, and it is flashing BetaFlight. And on advice of legal counsel, I have to tell you, I will not pay your psychiatry bills for what just happened to you on this video. Do not send them to me. I will not pay them. They will go to debt collectors, because that's what's going to happen. I won't say all of my bills do the same thing, but we do all live in 2023. So let's flash a flight controller, not pulling up our shirt required. Today I'm going to be using the Axis Flying Argus F7 AIO. It's a very new flight controller, just got it out of the box, and I want to flash it, because I'm going to build something with it. But before we get down to flashing it, let's talk about why you'd want to flash something and when you shouldn't flash something. I'm just going to go right out and say it. If you've never flashed a flight controller before, and you've got a brand new quad or a brand new flight controller you just pulled out of the box to build a brand new quad with, you probably don't need to flash it. You're probably better off just not touching it. That's honestly the best way to do things, is just run it like it came, especially if it's a bind and fly. If you flash it, there's a really good chance that something is not going to go right, and your brand new quad that you haven't even really flown yet might not fly anymore. If it's a brand new stack or a brand new flight controller that you're planning on swapping out in something, there's also a good chance that flashing it's going to mess something up, or the CLI diff, we'll get over what that is in a minute, will not work on the new version of BetaFlight and things go wrong. And then your new quad is no longer a quad. It is just a paperweight with 4 props and some motors. I've seen it happen too many times. So be very careful with flashing. If you think you might want to do it, you probably don't, but if you know for sure that you need to flash it for one reason or the other, those reasons might include a new feature in BetaFlight that you absolutely must have, a fix to BetaFlight that you absolutely must have, new features that enable things like Express LRS versions for small quads that you absolutely must have. Those are the kinds of things that you might want to consider flashing for, and those are the kind of things that I'll expect you're using this tutorial for. So those are the scenarios that we're going to run over. But first, let's get into BetaFlight. Let's plug our AIO, or whatever flight controller you might have here, into it and get a couple of preliminary steps out of the way. And now that this is plugged in, we're going to head over to the CLI tab, because we're going to take a diff. We're going to make a copy of the config that's currently on this, even if it's the one that came with it out of the box. If it's bind and fly, it had some stuff done to it from the factory. If it's just one from the manufacturer, you never know what's in there. Get a config diff every other time and save them. Always going to pull you out of a pickle, I promise. And to do that, we're going to type diff all here and hit enter, and you can see what the diff is, or the differences between the default config of this flight controller and what is currently in it. And for mine, because it is a brand new flight controller, there's really not a lot here. You see, there's just rate profile numbers. There's really not a whole lot of config here to tell me that it's any different than factory. But I'm still going to get it because, again, it could pull you out of a pickle. Always better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it, because you can't go backwards once we get to a certain point in this process. Always get a config diff during the flashing process before you ever start anything with firmware. Just a huge tip I've learned over breaking many a quad. And with this pulled up, we're just going to hit save to file here, and then you can pick a file and put it wherever you want. With that config backed up, now we're going to get into the flashing bit, the actual bits and bobs and greasy junk nards, I'd have made up that word, of the process here. So we're going to hit the disconnect button, and make sure that this little slider right here is not set to auto connect. Because at this point, if it is set to auto connect, it'll just connect right back to the flight controller, and you won't be able to get to this flashing page that I'm about to show you. So some people leave that on auto connect because they don't want to have to deal with pressing the button. Go ahead and make sure that is unchecked here. Then we're going to hit the update firmware section here. We have a lot of things to pick in this list. And this is going to be a time where you want to reference your manufacturer's documentation. Like I said, this is an Axis Flying Argus F7 AIO. It's a very new stack. But I did want to dig in and figure out what the target name is. Where it says choose a board here, that brings up a whole bunch of stuff. Now, I do have the option to hit auto detect, and in my case, it didn't actually detect what the board is. And that's because mine's so new. It's actually running a pre-release 4.5 version of BetaFlight, which is not quite out yet. But yours might have the same problem for other reasons. It may just not be able to auto-detect the target. So you'll want to go to the manufacturer's documentation and find the BetaFlight target name. Once you find that, that's what you're going to want to select in the search box. By typing whatever it is here, let's say I had a T-motor, there's a bunch of T-motor targets. So you just want to reference the manufacturer's documentation to pick which one of those is the correct one. In my case, because I have such a new board, I'm going to show you how release candidate firmware works, because some of you out there may want to try new features of 4.5. You may have 15 quads in the fleet, you've bought all bind and flies up to this point, and you want to flash one 4.5 just to play funsies. You've already got your CLI diff, so worst case, you just have to roll back to an older firmware version if things don't work out. If you do want to do something like that, that is what this show release candidate slider is for. And in this, we get a new option to pull down release and release candidate and development if we feel like it. Because this third box down here allows us to pick the version. And if we have release candidates on, we get newer versions of things than are actually released. But like I said, only do this if you're specifically wanting to test new features. This is not something you should do for quads you plan on flying regularly, because this is just for testing. If you're flashing normal stuff, stay completely away from the show release candidate slider entirely. You don't want to be bug testing on a quad you intend to fly daily and have it crash out of the sky into a pond. It's not what you are intending. And with that turned back off, I can just pick the stable releases. You can see I can choose from anything from 4.2.11 all the way up to 4.4.2. So I'm going to pick 4.4.2 as it's the newest version that is stable and available because, again, I have the show release candidate slider turned off. I'm not doing weird experimental things. There are a couple of other settings under this that we need to cover, though, like this no reboot sequence and full chip erase. And we'll start with full chip erase. I usually turn full chip erase on, because what that will do is instead of just flashing the BetaFlight firmware on top of your existing BetaFlight firmware, so replacing firmware to firmware, it actually clears the whole chip out. All of the EEPROM gets cleared, which means that the old config is gone, any potential corruption is gone, it just clears out the entire thing. It's kind of like a fresh start and a wipe, and I always use full chip erase because I always have a CLI diff to put back in here. Some people will just flash BetaFlight and not do a full chip erase and hope their configuration comes across. I never feel like that's a good idea. I always do a full chip erase and have a CLI diff to load back on. Don't ever trust in it to do it correctly, even though it might 90% of the time. That 10% is going to bite you, so just erase it and put your CLI diff, which you did remember to take, because we went over it, back on at the end of this, which I'll show you. And that just leaves us with the no reboot sequence option here. What this is for is to tell your flight controller to not reboot into flashing mode. There are some reasons for this. Most flight controllers, you just plug them into USB as if you were going to connect them to BetaFlight and do all your configurations. That's perfectly fine. And then when you go to the flasher like this, when we hit the flash button in a minute, it will send a reboot sequence to the flight controller, which will reboot the flight controller into flashing mode, or what's known as DFU mode. That is typically how this goes, but you might run up against some flight controllers that don't reboot properly. They send the reboot sequence and they just get stuck where they don't reboot into DFU and you never see it come up. The flight controller has the same lights that it would always have if it was connected to BetaFlight, the blinky, flashy, always on ones. DFU mode typically only has one light on and usually it's just a red light and it does nothing but stay solid. That's usually how you know that your flight controller's in flashing mode. Some of them just really hate to reboot into it. And if you have one of those, if you find yourself in that position, there are two things to try. If the flight controller reboots and doesn't do the single red light thing, then you know that it's because it's not taking the reboot command, and you'll want to use the no reboot sequence slider and manually put your flight controller into DFU mode. Most flight controllers have a boot button. You can find it on the diagram. If it's not a button, sometimes it's two pads that you have to short. You just take a pair of tweezers or something metallic and you cross it over the pads. If not, it's a button, and you hold the button down while you plug the USB in and power it up. That will boot it into flashing mode. It's a hardware flashing mode entrance, which always works. It is the failsafe that keeps us from breaking flight controllers. When that happens, it boots into DFU mode, and all is good. But If you have the no reboot sequence command unchecked, it will tell the DFU mode to reboot, in which case it will, and then it'll go right back to normal mode, and you'll be screwed. So, if you have a flight controller that manually needs to be put into DFU mode, that is what you want to do. No reboot sequence, make sure your flight controller's in DFU mode, plugged into USB. If you have any other flight controller that doesn't have difficulty with that, which most of them do not have difficulty and need to be manually put in DFU mode, just leave no reboot sequence off, and BetaFlight will reboot it into flashing mode for us. That's what this slider does. The other alternative, and we'll go over it here in a second, is if you do get into DFU mode with the single red light, and you still get the inability to flash. It just says, can't find serial port, or something like that. Then that's when you want to bust out the ImpulseRC driver fixer. This thing is super awesome. You boot the flight controller into DFU mode, and you just run it. It will install the necessary drivers and typically get you to be able to see DFU mode in the BetaFlight flasher within a few minutes. It sometimes takes a while to run, so be patient. It doesn't always have progress on the progress bar, but it gets you there. I've seen it happen a ton of times. So those are some issues you might run into with DFU mode and when you do and do not want to run the no reboot sequence. But now that we have that slider there figured out, let's move down to the more advanced section of the flashing tab that, honestly, if I'm being, just the bacon ninja that I am, I would avoid if I were you, unless you specifically know exactly what you want to be doing in it. I would just leave this whole section blank. But I'm still going to go over it just for the knowledge of it, the tasty, greasy, meaty goodness. Because this is the build configuration section. You'll notice we have a core-only slider, radio protocols, other options, custom-y things, all kinds of doody-dads down there. That is what's called the cloud build section. In other words, these settings that you have here will be sent to a server hosting BetaFlight firmware, and it will build your firmware in real time. Here in a minute, I'll show you where the buttons are, and send it back to you with all the custom things in it that you want. We have the radio protocols in a big drop-down box. You can either add or remove different protocols. You can see here this default is CRSF, Ghost, and SBus. If you needed something like iBus or Spectrum or XBus, whatever you might need, you can select it there and it will add it to the list and it will build your version of BetaFlight with that included. The next box is other options where we get GPS, LED strip, all these things by default. Maybe you are a person who never uses an SD-OSD. You can get rid of that if you wanted to. And then you can add a bunch of other stuff. Magnetometers, servos, cam control, all kinds of extra things can be added into your build of BetaFlight depending on what you're doing with it. But like I said, if you don't know specifically things that you want to go in here and do for very specific reasons, just leave it on the defaults because that's what comes with BetaFlight in the standard package, and that's likely all you're going to need, so just leave those alone. The custom defined section lets you type all kinds of good things in here, and yeah, you can add things like support for new gyros or new accelerometers or new magnetometers, barometers, all kinds of things. But it is very, very specific and you must type it in by hand. There is no drop-down box here. This is a spot that I use in another video that I'll link down below if for some reason you don't have a gyro on your flight controller and you know you flashed it correctly. There are some ways to get your gyro to work using this field, but it is like a 20-minute video just explaining how to use these settings. So, like I said, unless you know what you're doing there, just avoid this one too. The other box is pretty simple. Telemetry protocol, a bunch of options for that outside the standard ones, and then motor protocol. We always use D-Shot, but maybe you're wanting to run PWM for something super classic. That's where you would go to add support for it into your version. But now that we have all that picked, and by picked I mean left default because likely you don't need to actually add anything in there, it's time to actually flash this thingy, which starts with hitting the Load Firmware Online button. Now you can see it built it in the cloud, and there's a log that we could read if we want to, but it just built our firmware and then sent me a copy of the firmware for me to flash to this flight controller. So I hit flash firmware, my flight controller is going to reboot, I'm going to erase because I have a full chip erase like I talked about. It is doing the erasing procedure now, and then it will flash. And you'll notice in the top right corner now it says DFU STM32 bootloader. That is what it should say after the reboot sequence. And on my flight controller, you can see it here, I have a single red LED. I'm using the SpeedyBee Mini now because the Argus was actually too new to do all this with, so I switched flight controllers here. Not a big deal. But that's DFU mode, the single red LED. If you have blinkety LEDs, it did not go into DFU mode. If you have that single red LED and it doesn't say STM32 bootloader up there in the dropdown, you're probably having problems flashing right now, and you need to run the ImpulseRC driver fixer. And then also you can read these little notes here about how to put it manually into STM32 bootloader mode or DFU mode. That may help you out. You can try these steps. But as you can see, programming was successful and my flight controller is flashed. But we are not done yet. We're not. Because you took a CLI dump, my friend. You took a big old steaming text dump, and it's time to put that steaming text dump right back where it came from, as painful as it's going to be. Yeah, so we're going to hit the connect button. And this time when we connect, we get a question. And this question's super important. It asks you if you want to apply custom defaults, and you do want to apply custom defaults. 100,000% of the time, you want to apply custom defaults. What they do is they set things like which pin the gyro is connected to, which pin the barometer is connected to, which pin it's UARTs, which pins are motors. All those things are defined in software, or firmware, technically, and you do want to load those. Otherwise, if you hit cancel here, you will either have to manually do them all, or nothing on the board is going to work. And those aren't things you want. So, let's hit apply custom defaults. It will reboot the flight controller, and then we're able to connect to it again. Now I get some more warnings, but these are normal warnings. No motor output protocol, and the accelerometer is enabled but not calibrated. And at that point, you basically have a blank slate of a flight controller. It is as it would have come out of the box from the manufacturer, or maybe it did come out of the box from the manufacturer, and you just upgraded BetaFlight because you know you're going to do something extra special with this thing, not just because you can, because that's not ever a good idea. You will break your quads. I'm going to say it a bunch of times because at least 100 people a month in the Discord have this problem. So I'm saving you from it happening to you. Trust me. You don't want to do this to a thing for no good reason. Anyway, those are totally normal. Now we're going to load our CLI diff, and we're going to talk about the possibilities of what happens when we do that. And for that, we want to go to the CLI tab, and then we're going to hit load from file, and we're going to find the file that we pulled earlier. It's going to bring up a little like demo of all the config that it's going to put back in. And you can see this is what was in my flight controller prior, which is basically just the default standard stuff because mine didn't have a lot done to it. So totally expect this. It's totally normal. But we're going to hit execute, and it is going to load all that. Now you'll see a whole bunch of red here. There's a whole bunch of red. Resetting the defaults doesn't work. And then rate profile 4 and rate profile 5 doesn't work. It's all in red. That's a bad thing when you see red, especially in CLI. But in this case, that is because we took a CLI diff of something that was a different version of BetaFlight and applied it to a CLI input that is a different version of BetaFlight. In this case, it was 4.3 to 4.4. That is exactly how this happened. So what you're going to want to do is go through each one of these errors individually and determine if it's important or not. And if you don't know what they are, that's just another reason to not flash it. That's just another reason. If this was a bind and fly, maybe the manufacturer has a newer CLI dump of the BetaFlight version CLI that you need for what you just flashed to it, but maybe not. That's why this is an advanced thing to do, because you need to understand what all of these CLI lines are and what is important and what's not before you get down this road. Otherwise, there's not a lot of going back. If you are unsure at this point about what is safe and what is not safe, or unable to figure that out, or ask questions, have no one to ask, nowhere to turn, I recommend you just roll back to the flashing tab and flash the version of BetaFlight you just came off of, and then load the CLI diff, because the chance that you will have an undesirable result is high at this point, unless you can absolutely 100% confirm that these are not important settings that do not need to get written. Let's look at mine just as an example. This resetting to defaults, invalid resource name camera control, is because camera control is no longer built into BetaFlight 4.4. It's one of those things in the advanced cloud build section that I would have had to add if I wanted to support. So there's a setting in my old config that apparently calls it, and in this config, it doesn't exist. So I got a red line. And the other ones I have are for these rate profile outside of 0.3, because I'm on rate profile 4 and 5. Which are obviously outside of 0 and 3. Because in newer versions of BetaFlight, it only goes up to rate profile 3 from 0. You get a total of 4 rate profiles. So these error out. Now, in my case, none of these errors are things that matter to me. I don't have anything saved in rate profile 4 or 5, and I'm not going to use camera control anyway. So I'm just going to force save these things. But like I said, if they are unknown to you or sketchy or any of that, either get a new CLI from the manufacturer that is for specifically the version of BetaFlight that you are planning to flash, or just roll back to the old version of BetaFlight if you are 3/4 of the way into this, because the old CLI diff that you just loaded will work better in the BetaFlight it was made for. It just will. But, like I said, I'm going to force save mine just to show you what that looks like. And that can be done by just typing save and hitting enter. And then my flight controller will reboot. And once it reboots, I will have a brand new flight controller with my CLI config on it. Now, as of this video, there aren't any ways to convert a CLI diff from one version to another, or things that are saved can't be identified. There was at one point a website that would do that for older versions of BetaFlight that are no longer really in production on new quads or new flight controllers now, so they're not really going to apply here. But BetaFlight 4.4 and 4.3 have differences in their CLI, and 4.2 and 4.3 differences in their CLI, and I expect that 4.4 and 4.5, which is coming soon, will have differences in the CLI. So, the most important takeaway from this video: get your CLI dump, make sure that you understand what settings you're using in the flashing tab, understand what DFU mode looks like and what to do if it doesn't happen as expected, and make sure that you are comfortable reading through the errors in the CLI input afterwards, because if you're not, things could get wonky. That's just how it's going to go. But anyway, that's it. This was a bacon bit. It's not a super long video. There are a whole lot of other things that I could go through here to explain in more detail the flashing process in BetaFlight. But if you have any more questions, I have linked to my Discord server below, because a ton of awesome pilots hang out in there. There's like 500 of us over there now. And yeah, we can answer questions for you from experience. Not from a book necessarily, because some of us can't read books like me. I can only read letters written in breakfast meat or sausage links. Sausage links are breakfast meat. But if you lay them out in a particular order, I can tell what it says. But enough breakfast meat talk. You flashed your flight controller. That's it. I hope you learned something. I know you'll probably have questions, but go ask them in the Discord. And until next time, stay greasy, and I'll catch you later. And now it's time for the list of people who supported me lifting my shirt up at the beginning of this video. They didn't support it knowingly. I did not tell them it was going to happen. But it happened. Oh yeah, it happened. And on the thumbnail of this video, I photoshopped myself some abs that don't exist, because these people supported it with their hard-earned money. That's the kind of spending decisions they make. Tells you something, doesn't it? But really, though, I couldn't do it without them. Thank you so much, patrons, for supporting this kind of content and helping others share knowledge from others, for others, by others. That's totally what it's about in the FPV community. Yeah, I'll keep my shirt down from now on.